The wind cut harder when you had nothing left to cover your name. Agnes Bell Dawson stepped through the snow barefoot, holding her baby tight against her chest, the cloth sack wrapped around Junie barely thick enough to stop the cold from seeping in. Her lips had split from windburn days ago, and she didn't feel her toes anymore. But her arms, they still ached from holding her child close. Some kind of mercy, maybe, to still feel that pain. She passed the livery where the horses stared with soft, knowing eyes, their warm breath fogging up the cracked barn boards. Past the saloon where laughter rang out like cruelty. Past the general store's frosted window where the sacks of flowers sat like fat kings, unreachable. No one opened their doors to her. No one called her name. They'd spoken it once, that name, Agnes Bell, softly at church socials, back when her hair was long and her dresses clean. But now they only muttered it behind closed curtains. She didn't last a season without him. That baby cries day and night. Too proud to leave, too stubborn to die. Her husband had lasted until the first frost. Pleurisy, the doctor said, though no doctor ever came. Just coughing, and then more coughing, and then blood. They buried him behind the chapel, with no preacher and no stone. Just the wind, always the wind. That morning, Agnes had gone to a mercantile and placed the last of her coin, 3 bent cents and a button, on the counter. "Milk," she whispered. The shopkeeper had looked at her the way one looks at spoiled meat. "That baby still got lungs, huh?" he muttered. "Ain't got charity, Agnes Bell. Not for what you're offering." She didn't answer. She just stood there as the coins were pushed back toward her with the edge of a ledger. So she did the only thing a starving woman with a living baby can do in a town that's turned cold. She wrote a note and pinned it to her coat. Then she walked to the square, where the stockmen haggled over mules and broken saddles, and stood at the edge of the wooden platform, eyes down, the child wrapped tight against her. The square smelled of wet hides and frozen manure. Boots stomped and spurs jingled. But when she stepped forward, the noise dropped as if someone had put a hand to the sky and hushed it. A voice called out, Miss Temperance Vale, cold-eyed and tight-lipped, always the one to oversee desperate things. "Agnes Bell Dawson has offered herself for sale," she announced with a sneer that tried to pass for decency. "For room, board, and milk, the child included." Someone laughed. A dry, mean sound. "She was married just last year. Ain't this a fast fall?" one voice jeered. "She still got teeth?" said another. "Teeth in trouble," murmured a third. But she didn't flinch, didn't raise her head. Let the snow fall on her shoulders like dust on a grave. Miss Temperance cleared her throat. "Opening offer?" "Nothing." Then a chuckle. A drunk waved a bottle. "I'll trade her for my wife. She's quieter." "Half a sack of cornmeal," someone said, "and not the fresh kind." Agnes's fingers tightened around Junie. The baby stirred but didn't cry. Too weak, maybe, or too used to silence. Her heart thudded in her ears, but her face stayed calm, the way her husband used to breathe through broken ribs after falling from a horse. Then the crowd shifted. A man stepped forward from the back, tall and broad, with frost melting off his shoulders and a faded brown hat pulled low. Boaz Maddock. People didn't speak to him much. They said he talked more to his horse than he did to humans, that he lived so far out the hills forgot he was there, that he buried his own father without asking the town for help. He walked up to the platform and met Miss Temperance's gaze. Said nothing. She squinted. "You making an offer?" He nodded once. "How much?" "Full." Gasps. A ripple of confusion. One man spat in the snow. "Boaz." Sheriff Hoyt muttered from a spot near the bench. "You sure? This ain't a stray dog you're picking up." Boaz looked at Agnes. Not up and down. Not with hunger. Just a quiet, long look that didn't ask for anything. "She comes with a baby," the sheriff said, "and gossip, and trouble you don't need." Boaz just held out his hand. Agnes stared at it for a long second. Then she stepped off the platform, slow like a deer walking into a trap it hopes is mercy. The town didn't clap. They didn't cheer. Just turned away like closing shutters in storm. The deal was done. He offered her his coat. She hesitated. Took it. It hung heavy over her shoulders, the scent of pine and horses clinging to it. Her teeth chattered, but her eyes didn't cry. I'll work, she whispered. Boaz nodded. That's not why I brought you. They walked away without speaking, past the stores that had locked her out, past the church where no one had offered comfort. Her boots, too small, cut at her ankles. Her child whimpered. Still, for the first time in weeks, Agnes did not feel like she was falling through her days. She felt held, not by his hand, but by the space beside him, by the quiet. At the edge of town, a hawk circled low over the tree-line. A wind caught her dress and lifted it like a warning, or maybe a promise. She didn't know yet which. They crossed into the hills as the snow began again, soft and wide and slow, like God was trying to cover something broken in a sheet of light. The cabin sat like a held breath at the edge of the tree line, its roof low and slanted, walls gray with wind and years. It had no curtains on its windows, just open glass, fog slightly from the inside where the fire breathed. The snow came down heavy that night, gentle but sure, and Boaz didn't speak a word as they crossed the last ridge. He only opened the door and stepped aside, letting the warmth spill out into the dark. Agnes paused before stepping in. She hadn't walked through a threshold without fear in months. Her hands clutched Junie tighter, her cheeks red with wind and heat and something harder to name. Inside, the cabin was simple. Rough plank floors, a stone hearth already burning low, a tin kettle muttering steam. A pine table with uneven legs stood in one corner, a single wooden bed against the back wall, its quilt faded from blue to memory, and not a curtain in sight, just the night pressing in, soft and secretive. Boaz took off his hat, shook the snow from it, and hung it by the door. Then he knelt by the fire and fed it more wood. The room brightened and warmed. Still, he said nothing. Agnes stood there a moment longer. Then, without asking, she lowered herself slowly to the floor near the wall, tucking her baby close, like an animal unsure of its shelter. Her eyes darted around, reading the place the way hungry folk read a pantry, not for comfort, but for threat. Boaz didn't look at her, just stirred the fire, then laid his coat across a bent chair and moved toward the shelf. He pulled down a loaf of hard bread, a jar of beans, a folded cloth, set them on the table like offerings at a grave. The meal was eaten in silence. Agnes didn't touch the bread at first. She watched him instead, how he chewed slow, respectful, how he poured water into a tin cup and offered it without looking her in the eye, how he set another log on the fire just before it dimmed. She took the water, let Junie nurse in the dark. That night, Boaz took a blanket and lay down near the hearth, facing away from her, boots still on, hand resting lightly near a hunting knife. Not a threat, just habit. Agnes didn't ask for the bed. She curled on the floorboards and placed Junie in the crook of her arm. The baby slept like she hadn't in weeks. Agnes didn't. The next morning, she woke to the smell of wood smoke and boiled oats. The light coming in was soft and golden, the kind that makes frost look like silver. Boaz was already up, feeding the fire. He didn't greet her, didn't ask how she slept. He simply slid a bowl across the table and nodded once. She nodded back. After breakfast, he left for the barn. She watched through the window, Junie in her arms, as he shoveled snow, fed the horses, mended a split fence rail. He moved like a man built for loneliness, steady, unbothered, without hurry. That afternoon, she found a rag and tried to wash the soot from the panes of glass. Her fingers burned from the cold, and the rag froze stiff in her hands. When Boaz came in from the barn and saw her struggling, he didn't scold or stop her. He simply walked to the small chest near the hearth, pulled out a pair of brown wool gloves, and held them out. She took them without a word. There were no questions between them, not about past, not about plans. Agnes didn't ask what he expected of her. Boaz didn't ask what she'd done to be standing in that square. They move around each other with the quiet grace of those who know pain and don't need it named. Junie began to fuss again by the third night, her small belly twisted with gas, her cries shrill and broken. Agnes rocked her through the dark, knees sore from the floor. She whispered lullabies she barely remembered, voice cracked from cold and fear. Nothing helped. Boaz didn't sleep. She could feel it, the quiet tension in his back, the way he shifted near the firelight, awake but still. Near dawn, As the wind began to pick up, he rose, stepped outside, and returned a moment later with something wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it slowly. A fiddle, old and scuffed, string still taut. He sat down across from her and tuned it with the care of a man brushing dust from a grave. Then, with no ceremony, he began to play. The melody was low and strange, something neither sad nor sweet, but steady. It filled the little cabin like warm smoke. Junie stilled. Agnes blinked against sudden tears. No one had played music in her home since before the cough, before the loss. The sound filled the spaces grief had hollowed out. When the song ended, Boaz stood, set the fiddle down, and went back to his blanket. Junie was asleep. Agnes sat motionless beside the fire, her hand pressed over her mouth. He hadn't played for applause, hadn't even looked at her. He had simply played because her baby cried. The next day, she searched the woods behind the cabin, bundled tight in his coat. She found herbs she barely remembered the names for, wild fennel, sweetroot, thornleaf, and carried them home in a folded rag, brewed them, sipped the tea herself first, then let Junie suckle the warmth from her skin. That night, the baby slept, and so did Agnes. The days turned slower after that. Boaz built her a clothesline behind the cabin, strung between two pine trees. She washed his shirts without asking. He repaired the broken stair on the porch. She gathered berries from the far hill. He carved new handles for her kitchen tools. Neither said thanks. The work was their language. One morning, she woke to find a cradle outside the door. Simple pine, sanded smooth, lined with soft cloth and a quilt she didn't recognize. She touched the wood like it was bone, something sacred. He said nothing, just nodded toward it and saddled his horse. Agnes brought the cradle in, placed Junie inside, watched her sleep, one hand resting on her small chest like she was afraid her own breath might startle her. That evening, as the fire hissed and the wind tapped the windows with cold fingers, Agnes sat in the rocker Boaz had brought in from the barn. She rocked Junie slow, thinking of all the rooms she'd passed through, hot with shame, cold with judgment, loud with hunger. And now this one, quiet, warm, uncurtained. She glanced at Boaz, who was cleaning his rifle by the door. The firelight caught the lines in his face, made him look older, kinder. He didn't smile. Neither did she. But when Junie laughed in her sleep, they both looked up at the same moment. And that was the first time their eyes met without flinching. It was a Tuesday when Agnes decided she'd walk into town. The sky was pale and wide, winter breaking slowly into mud and thaw, but she wrapped herself in Boaz's coat anyway and tucked Junie close beneath its folds. There was no invitation, no permission asked, just a need, flour, salt, and thread, and a pull inside her like a rope tied to a distant bell, silent but tugging. Boaz didn't stop her. He only handed her a tin box with coins and said, "Storekeepers still count slower if you don't smile. Just so, you know." She didn't smile, just nodded and began walking. The road curved downward, past frost-nipped pines and a stream that still ran beneath its ice. She passed a hawk circling low, its shadow trailing her like memory. The sun came through in streaks, and her boots left prints too shallow to last. She felt her heart knock once, then again. The town rose ahead like a story she'd left unfinished. At the general store, no bell rang when she entered, just silence, and then the scrape of wood as heads turned. Miss Temperance stood by the bolts of fabric, her gloved hands resting over her ledger. She saw Agnes first. Her eyes did not widen, but her spine straightened with something like delight. "Well," she said slowly, "if it isn't the Maddock bride. Or is it Dawson still? I never did get a wedding notice." Agnes moved past her without speaking, Junie asleep against her chest. The child had grown quiet these days, not because she lacked strength, but because she'd learned the value of silence too soon. The shopkeeper pretended not to notice Agnes. He finished weighing a sack of sugar for someone else before turning with forced surprise. "Oh, you! What can I do for the Lady of the Ridge?" Agnes named her list: flour, salt, thread, cloth for diapers. Her voice was steady. He filled the order but slow, measuring each grain of flour like it might shame him to serve her. "You paying with your husband's money?" he asked. loud enough for the two women near the windows to hear. One of them laughed behind her palm. Agnes said nothing, just handed over the coin box. When she turned to leave, Miss Temperance blocked the doorway. "You know," she said, folding her arms, "it used to be that when a woman gave herself away, she stayed away. Quiet, grateful. You walking around like you got something to show, like we should all forget what you were standing on that platform for." Agnes stared past her toward the street. Her jaw was tight. Her hands held Junie tighter. "I didn't forget," Agnes said softly. "You did." Temperance's face went still, then sharp. "Don't act like a martyr. You weren't sold to save the world. You were sold because you were empty-handed. That's all." Agnes stepped sideways, past her without touching. She felt the heat of stairs trail after her all the way down the boardwalk. Outside, the sky had shifted. Clouds thickened, wind rising. She walked slow, let the baby rest. Let the shame slide down her back like a familiar shawl. But she noticed something then. A boy whispering to his sister. A woman crossing the street to avoid her. A group of young men nudging each other and grinning. The gossip had grown teeth. She sold herself, and now she walks proud. Betty's not even touched her. Bought a ghost. She's teaching that baby to beg. Boaz had warned her in his quiet way. But words don't sting like eyes do. By the time she returned to cabin, dusk had bruised the sky. Boaz was chopping wood near the barn. When she came up the path, he paused, leaned on the axe, and watched her. "She sleep through it?" he asked. "She knows when to be still," Agnes said. Then, softer, "They're saying more now. Worse." He set the axe down and nodded once. "They don't know how to stop once they start. Same as dogs with blood in their teeth." That night, Agnes couldn't sleep. She stood by the window and looked out into the trees, the wind playing with the naked branches like a harp. The fire crackled, low and slow, behind her. Boaz sat near it, carving something from wood. "She called me a ghost," Agnes whispered. "She don't know you. She knew me before the sickness, before Junie. She used to bring pears in summer and ask for stitching patterns." Boaz's blade paused. "You're not the same," he said. "No," Agnes murmured, "but I'm still me." A few days later, a knock came at the door. Not loud, not hurried. Agnes opened it to find Sheriff Hoyt standing with his hat in one hand, snow dusting his boots. He didn't smile. "Just checking in," he said. "On Boaz. On your situation." Boaz stepped into view behind her. His presence filled the doorway without trying. "Everything's fine," he said. "I heard about the trip into town," Hoyt added, not looking at Agnes. "People are restless, wondering what kind of household you're running. No ring, no vows, no pastor's record." Boaz didn't flinch. Didn't know it was a crime to feed a mother and child. "It ain't," the sheriff said. "But it sure ain't the kind of example we want spreading." Boaz leaned against the doorframe. "What exactly are you hoping to spread? Kindness?" Hoyt gave a thin smile. "You always were a strange one, Boaz. Folk give you room because you're quiet. But even quiet men can stir trouble if they stand with the wrong sort." Boaz nodded slowly. "Then I guess I'll be trouble." He shut the door. Agnes stared at him, heart hammering. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," he said simply. She stepped back. "They'll talk more now." "I hope they do." That evening, Agnes stepped outside and found something tied to the porch rail, a small parcel wrapped in paper. Inside, a scrap of lace, torn and stained. No note, just a message. She threw it into the fire. The cabin warmed deeper that night. Junie slept in her cradle, one hand flopped over the edge. Agnes sat by the fire, knees drawn up, Boaz sharpening his knife across the room. "I don't want to disappear," she said suddenly. Boaz looked up. "I don't want to shrink into the corners of this house," she said, "even if it's safe here." "You haven't," he said. "I feel like a ghost when I walk outside, like I'm wearing someone else's skin." He set the blade down and walked over, slow, steady, not reaching for her, just standing near enough to lend warmth. "You're not someone else," he said. "You're just not done becoming yet." She looked up at him. "Neither am I," he added. And for the first time, she saw the ghost in him too, the one he'd never spoken of. The reason his eyes always watched the fire too long. The silence he carried like a second coat. And in that moment, something shifted. Not a kiss, not a promise. Just the space between them softening. She reached for the cradle, tucked Junie in tighter, then leaned back, letting her body relax in the chair like she belonged in it. For the first time, she believed maybe she did. The thaw came soft and slow that year, like the land itself was ashamed to rise from sleep. Ice cracked down the middle of the creek, and the snow shrank into patches, leaving behind wet earth that smelled of moss and forgotten things. Sap ran in the trees again, and crows called from the bare pines with voices too loud for quiet they'd left behind. Agnes hung her laundry on the line Boaz had strung between two trees months ago. Shirts, underthings, the baby's cloths, her apron. But that day, she carried something else, the folded wedding dress he'd left in the chest. Not new, not fancy, but white once and still soft in places. She hadn't touched it since the day he offered it, wrapped like a wound. That day she hadn't known how to hold something that had once meant honor. But something had shifted in her lately. She still felt the shame. Some shames do not fade, they just settle. But now she felt something else rising to meet it. Dignity, perhaps, or maybe just a kind of stubbornness that said, "I will not vanish." She washed the dress by hand, careful not to pull too hard on the seams. Let the warm water soak through the fibers. Watched the stains dissolve like ghosts leaving cloth. Her fingers trembled. She didn't know why. Then she hung it beside the other clothes and stepped back. It caught the wind like a sail. For a moment, it rose above her, wide and bright, and nearly blinding in the early sun. And something inside her lifted, too, not pride exactly, but memory. She remembered being a girl and sewing ribbon into her hair. She remembered her husband before the sickness. She remembered being looked at without pity. She stood there, staring at it, and did not flinch when Boaz walked up behind her. He didn't speak, just followed her gaze to the dress and watched it move. "You ever dance?" she asked suddenly. He didn't answer at first. "Once," he said. "Didn't take." She looked over at him. "I'd like to learn. Someday." His lips tilted at one corner. "I ain't much of a teacher." She didn't smile back, just nodded. Still, they stood there a long moment longer, the breeze lifting strands of her hair, the dress dancing on its line like a flag raised not in surrender, but survival. Later, she mended it with her own thread, changed the sleeves to fit her arms, cut the hem an inch higher so it wouldn't drag in the mud. She stitched a small flower into the collar, just one in blue thread, something hers. The days began to brighten. Boaz built a chicken pen. Agnes started a small garden. Scratching rose into the earth behind the cabin. She didn't know if anything would grow, but she planted anyway, carrots, onions. Something called lovage she found in the hills. Junie began to crawl, her hands slapping the floor like soft hooves. She followed the sunbeams that slanted through the glass, squealing when the light landed on her fingers. Boaz built her a small toy horse from driftwood. Agnes caught him smoothing the legs with his sleeve, so it wouldn't splinter. He didn't notice she was watching. One afternoon, Boaz didn't come in from the west field. Agnes waited longer than usual. Junie napped in her cradle, the room growing darker with each hour. Finally, Agnes pulled on her boots, saddled a second horse, and rode out with the wind scratching at her face. She found him past the fence line, slumped in the grass, pale and shaking. A snake had struck his leg, fang marks high above the boot. The blood had already turned dark around the wound. He tried to stand when he saw her, but she dropped to her knees and pressed him back. "Don't," she said. "Let me." His breath was ragged. "You shouldn't be come alone." Then you shouldn't be stayed out here. She tore her sleeve and tied it above the wound, heart thudding so loud she could barely think. She helped him onto the horse, climbed behind, and held him upright all the way back, whispering things she hadn't said aloud in years. Prayers, baby names, songs without melody. Her arms locked around him like he was a truth she wasn't ready to lose. She boiled herbs through the night, packed around with poultice, cooled his head with cloths. She dipped again and again into snow water. She told Junie stories just to stay awake, about the stars, about brave girls, about how someday they'd grow cucumbers big as boots. He woke near dawn, blinking up at her like she was the only thing left in the world worth looking at. She exhaled for the first time in hours. Storm passed, he croaked. I didn't ask it to, she murmured. No, he said, voice rough, but you face it anyway. She didn't cry, but she did touch his face, her first touch of him not born from necessity. He reached for her wrist but didn't pull, just held it lightly, as if her bones were glass. That morning, she stepped outside with a blanket around her shoulders and looked at the sky. The wind had died. The earth smelled rich again. And across the yard on the line, the wedding dress still hung, whiter now, stiffer from drying but clean. She didn't take it down. Not yet. She left it there through the day, through the next night, through the week. Let the town wonder if she was preparing for something. Let the forest carry whispers of it on the wind. Let the crows pass word to the sky. And when the dress caught the sun just right, it gleamed like forgiveness. The snow came late that year, soft and quiet like a secret. But when it did, it settled thick, blanketing every fence post and chimney in a hush that felt holy. Even the trees bent under its weight, without complaint. The air held its breath. Inside the cabin, Agnes stood before the hearth in the white dress. She had mended it 3 times since spring. The hem bore a new patch where Junie had tugged loose a thread, and she'd sewn small red berries onto the cuffs to give it life. It didn't look like a wedding dress anymore. It looked like something made from silence and stubbornness. It looked like hers. Boaz sat at the table with Junie on his lap, letting her tug at his beard and drool on his sleeve. He didn't speak when Agnes turned to face him, but something in his posture changed. His shoulders pulled back a little, like a man bracing for beauty. She moved closer, and Junie reached out, tiny fingers brushing the fabric. Agnes smiled. They invited us, she said. Boaz looked up. Temperance came with the sheriff. Said the Founders' Day celebration would be a fine chance to be seen as respectable. His brow lifted, dry. She means watched, he said. She means judged, Agnes replied. Boaz lifted Junie into the crook of one arm. You want to go? Agnes exhaled. The fire crackled low beside her. I don't want to go, she said, but I think I need to. The town hall was lit with lanterns strung from the beams, golden light, making it would glow like honey. The windows had been scrubbed clean for the first time in a year, and fiddle music drifted out into the snow-covered street. Outside, carriages lined the edges of the square. Men in stiff collars smoked pipes and watched their wives with guarded pride. The air buzzed with baked bread, spice cider, and hidden intentions. Agnes stood at the edge of the square, the wind curling her hair around her cheeks. She held Junie in one arm, the child bundled tight in a wool shawl Boaz had stitched himself. Her boots were clean, her eyes steady. She hadn't worn the white dress to be noticed. She'd worn it to be seen. The moment she stepped inside, the room fell to a hush too sharp to be anything but planned. Temperance stood near the cider table, dressed in mourning gray despite the season. Sheriff Hoyt was beside her, leaning on the wall with arms crossed. A few heads turned. One woman gasped. Another whispered something behind her fan. Boaz walked behind Agnes, one hand at her back, not pushing, not guiding, just there, steady, present. They crossed the room like a rumor turned real, each step loud in the mind if not the ear. Agnes felt heat rise to her face, but didn't look down, didn't hide Junie, didn't stop. A space opened near the hearth where the dancing was slow and awkward, the kind of waltzing that was more swaying than stepping. Boaz held out a hand. She looked at him. We'll be terrible, she murmured. Let him talk, he said. So they danced, if it could be called that. His hand firm at her back, her hand trembling in his. Her heart thudded like thunder trapped in snow. The music stumbled, and so did they, but no one dared laugh, because something in the way he looked at her made mockery feel small. Around them, conversation resumed. Someone coughed. A chair scraped. Miss Temperance poured herself cider with a hand that trembled. Sheriff Hoyt stepped forward as the music paused. He stopped a foot from Boaz and said in a low voice, "You think this makes it right?" Boaz tilted his head. "Don't reckon I asked you." Hoyt's jaw tightened. "Town has rules." "And Snow doesn't care," Boaz said. "It covers everyone the same." Hoyt looked at Agnes. "You're still who you were." She lifted her chin. "So are you." The sheriff opened his mouth, then shut it, turned, walked away. And just like that, the room breathed again. Boaz stepped aside so Agnes could speak with the women who lingered near the wall. She didn't go to them, not at first. But then one came forward. Edna, the butcher's wife. A woman whose oldest son had thrown a stone at the cabin once, months ago. "I like your dress," Edna said. "It's honest." Agnes nodded. "That's all I know how to wear." Another woman joined. Then another. They didn't apologize, but they didn't look away either. And that was something. By the time the night ended, Agnes had danced twice, drunk half a mug of warm cider, and laughed once, quietly but freely. Boaz never left her side. Not as shadow, not as shield, but as presence, as witness. They walked home in the dark, snow falling again in slow flakes that caught the lamplight like fireflies. Junie slept in Boaz's arms, her breath puffing soft against his coat. Agnes walked beside him, holding her skirts in one hand. "Do you feel different?" he asked. "No," she said, then smiled faintly. "But I feel seen." He nodded, the snow catching in his beard. They reached the cabin near midnight. The fire inside was still warm. Boaz carried Junie in and laid her gently in her cradle. Agnes lit a lantern and hung her dress near the hearth to dry. The edges were damp with melted snow. The hem held a bit of mud, but she didn't scrub it clean. She left the marks there. She sat beside the fire while Boaz made tea. He brought her a mug, then sat across from her, watching her face in the low light. "I kept thinking," she said softly, "what if I'd never gone to town that day? What if you hadn't come forward?" Boaz stared into fire. "You still would have lived," he said, "but not like this." He looked at her then, and she met his gaze without fear. "I'm not ashamed of what I did," she said, "but I am tired of carrying it alone." "You don't have to," he said. They sat in silence a while, the fire snapping gently, the wind pushing against the cabin like a child wanting in. Agnes leaned her head against the back of the chair and closed her eyes. Junie stirred once in her sleep, then quieted again. And for the first time, the quiet didn't ache. It hummed. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft as forgiveness, steady as memory. In the distance, the town might still whisper. But in the hills, where the trees held their breath and the wind kept its counsel, no one asked who she used to be, only who she was now. And that, at last, was hers to answer. And maybe, dear heart, that's the lesson you needed to find here. That no matter how you enter the world, auctioned, abandoned, misunderstood, it is not shame that defines you. It is what you choose to plant in its soil. A baby's laugh, a clean dress, a second fire, a man's quiet hand. And when the town still whispers, let them, the snow already knows.